Welcome to Green and Gold FC.
And then poked home by Tim Cahill. Australia have done it.
Could write the Matildas into history. Cue the party.
The best team of the A-League era. And it goes. Tyler! It's a save that means the world to Australia.
Welcome to Green and Gold FC, the podcast for the fans, by the fans. We are back after a bit of a hiatus to chat about the A-League, about the Socceroos, and about some of the under-20 results, as well as many other topics. So first of all, welcome back, Alex.
Thank you very much, Graham. Happy to be back. And look, as you mentioned, it's been a while. It's been a while since we've been here sort of discussing all things Australian football. And to be honest, I've missed it quite a lot. I think there's quite a few people out there that have, well, maybe, hopefully, should I say, missed hearing our voices discuss pretty much all things about the beautiful game down under. And hopefully, we've got plenty of stuff to discuss today. So hopefully some good insight from you and myself.
Absolutely. So just an announcement to all those listening. We now have a Patreon. Look at our Patreon. We'll tweet about it quite frequently. We've tweeted about it. It's also on our forum, greenandgoldfc.com. And this basically keeps the show on the road. We will run this show probably at a loss. But the amount of episodes we have will basically be determined by how much we get in that Patreon. So it costs $40 per episode. So we absolutely need those donations. I can probably support more maybe in 12 months. But at the moment, I could do only so much. So please look at that Patreon. Please support us.
Yeah, as someone who's done YouTube for about 2.5 years now, I think one thing that people really don't realize is that there is a cost behind it, especially podcasting, production cost, editing cost, all that kind of stuff. And yeah, glad that we finally have the Patreon up and running. So I know we have a lot of fantastic support out there in the forums and in the wider football community in Australia. So hopefully we're able to keep this show coming to you guys as regularly as possible because quite frankly, I love doing these episodes and I've quite missed it.
Awesome. Speaking of your episodes, let's start with the Socceroos. I thought no one could have a bigger reaction than Popovic. That video of him celebrating Azizbej's goal was absolutely nuts. But then I saw your reaction. You were in the crowd doing a live video blog. Yeah, so take us through it. What was that like live?
That game in particular, like I'll touch on that in a moment, but that game in particular was one of the most painful experiences I've ever experienced, for a lack of a better term. It felt like I was put under the worst form of Chinese water torture I've ever experienced. And to be honest, I don't want to ever experience a game of football like that ever again. I felt like I was back in the 2017-18 Premier League watching Burnley and some other relegation fodder going through scrapping a 0-0 draw. It was just that kind of game. And look, the thing is, I was so disappointed to see our lineup, our front three being so makeshift without a conventional striker as well, especially considering that Japan had what was pretty much an entirely rotated starting 11, including their back line. It was just pain, but we'll touch more on the game in a second. That moment though, I think Popper's reaction just summed it up perfectly. And look, we definitely had plenty of scenes in the crowd. Weren't too many surrounding us because we were sat in general admission and there were quite a lot of Japanese fans sat around us, but it was a crazy moment nonetheless. One of my mates, Jacob, flew over specifically for the game. He was, well, I'd have to say if I feel good for anyone, I feel good for him because he was 2 minutes away from paying over $1,000 on plane tickets just to come over here and watch a 0-0 draw, which I think would have been absolutely awful for anyone. But you know what? That moment there is probably one of the best moments I've ever experienced as a football fan in person. And I don't think it's going to be topped for a long, long time.
So where's it rank? You have Redmayne's save. You have Lecky's amazing moment versus Denmark. Going back further, you have Cahill against Netherlands. I don't know how far back I can go. I think you weren't too old when you saw Eloise's penalty to get us into the World Cup. You also have James Torrisi getting us into the WDSC Asian Cup. Yeah, of course, you have amazing moments for the women's game. That penalty shootout against France. Sam Kerr's absolute missile against England. Where does this one rank?
Look, in terms of in person, since Perth doesn't really get a lot of good football, I'd have to say this is probably the only similar experience I can equate it to that I've at least been to in person is probably the A-League semi-final penalty shootout win over Adelaide when we made the final. But apart from that, in terms of Australian footballing moments, this has to be up there. I mean, maybe it negates the effect a bit considering that it was such a terrible game for one, and two, the job is not done yet. We still have to get past Saudi Arabia. But the context behind it was absolutely huge. Look, obviously, I don't think it touches the level of Aloisi's penalty against Uruguay. In my opinion, that is the undisputed greatest moment in Australian football history, and I don't think it's ever going to be beaten. Maybe if we win a World Cup sometime, maybe. But until that happens, I don't think that's getting topped. It was a fantastic moment. I can't believe that for a team in ourselves that haven't beaten Japan since 2009, I don't know if you knew that, Graham, but we haven't beaten them before this game in 16 years. And to do it at home in the 90th minute to put us so close to qualifying for the 2026 World Cup in North America, it has to be, I'd say, easily top 5. Arguably, I'd say maybe top 3. I'd put it up there with Aloisi's. I'd put it up there with penalty. And you know what? A sleeper pick, maybe even Lecky's goal against Denmark to round out that top 3.
It was incredible. I have watched that clip of Bajic maybe 30 or 40 times. I've changed my profile pic to that clip. But before we analyze the game, let's I do want to touch on one negative. Obviously the crowd went absolutely nuts when Bajic went in. But the active support, the crowd, it was not what I'm used to from a football game, especially a sold out football game. All I could hear was Vamos Nippon sung over and over again by the Japanese away supporters. You were in the crowd. Was the atmosphere as terrible as it sounded on TV? Are they muting the crowd or something?
It started really, really good. Very, very hot, fiery crowd. Well, that came from both sides, especially the Socceroos fans. But look, I saw a lot of people sort of slinging shit on Perth and their football culture in general, saying, you know, we can't really have these big games in Perth because they don't bring the noise and, you know, all that kind of stuff. But I wouldn't put it down to that. I would say in any footballing climate, it is really, really hard to get super involved and invested in your team when you are sitting 10 players behind the ball for the entirety of the night. In fact, we were sitting 11 behind the ball. I don't know, you yourself have told me that you watched back that game. The whole pressing structure was so incredibly poor. We weren't even trying for a lot of the game. We didn't create any sort of good chances. And to the crowd's fairness, every time we did sort of get the ball in the opposition half, they were ready to go. It's just the atmosphere was so poor because Popovic and the Socceroos really gave them nothing to get behind. And I'd say that's probably a large reason why the atmosphere was so poor. The biggest disappointment for me was that if that Bajic goal didn't go in, the highlight of the night for most of the fans to take away would have been that the Mexican wave went around the stadium about 3 times. That's just a perfect indicator of what kind of game that was up until the 90th minute, to be honest. But look, the Japanese fans did great. They sort of, I guess, kept the energy going a bit, which is nice, and what you sort of expect from Southeast Asian football fans. But yeah, I really hope to see the Socceroos pick up their active support, at least in the coming years.
Okay, so let's move on to the actual game itself. It was definitely one for the absolute, different type of purists, one that enjoys really good defense. Defense was dominating that game. Let's start with the positives. After watching the game a second time, I did have, last time I watched Popper's games a second or third time, I pick up a lot of things which I really appreciate. This time I have a mixture of criticism but let's start with the praise. That defense. That was just an absolute shutdown. Yes, we have 10 behind the ball, but I think Japan got their first touch in the middle of the park in front of the goal against a set defense. I think their first touch was in the 3rd minute, and Riley Uruguay's first is instantly possessing them. Everything was down the wing. And, you know, when we have been on the other side of that, when we're trying to break down a deep block and we're pushed to relying on our wing play, that's very frustrating to watch. You've clearly are struggling to break down that team if you have to rely on wing play. And secondly, they're only relying on one wing. So you have Metcalf is defending on the left-hand side along with Bajic in the first half. And so they just can't get any penetration down that wing at all. They have to go down the other side. And then the second half, Metcalf changes side. He's defending on Miller's side. Then everything goes down Bajic's side. I think I looked at the XG for that. I think as Japan managed in 90 minutes, 0.47 for the entire match, which is absolute domination from the defense. And I think half of that was probably Kubo's chance at the end, was probably the only real chance. So starting with the positives, that was an incredible defensive performance. Maybe we don't want to only have defense, but still, what are your thoughts on that?
I completely agree with you 100%. That was a stalwart defensive performance from the entire team. Look, I think some people were a bit harsh on Popper's selections for the defense going into the game. I personally had no problem with it. I liked the inclusion of Miloš Degenek. I thought he had a fantastic game. Cameron Burgess, I was a little bit concerned at his lack of pace, especially the fact that you had Aziz Bajic sort of covering down his side, but he proved to be fantastic. And look, I cannot say enough good things about Alessandro Cecchati. He is an absolute phenom, and the fact that we managed to get him before he got poached by the Italian national team is absolutely outrageous. I genuinely believe that he is probably better than a couple of the centre-backs that are in contention for the Italian national team. So the fact that we've got him is a huge scalp, an absolutely massive pull, and hopefully an indicator that we can attract some top sort of dual national talents going forward. Look, everything about that defensive performance was pretty much perfect. Jason Guerrier, when he came on, looked fairly strong at the end. The defensive midfield performance was really, really good. I thought Teague was a bit sort of hard done by not to see out a little longer than the 45 minutes that he did get. But Patrick Yashbek, to be fair, his cameo was really something special. I thought he did fantastic when he came on.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned the press. That was very interesting to look at that. So looking at Popper's previous games, he likes to have pressing triggers. So he'll just sit back and kind of rope-a-dope. And then if a pressing trigger happens, you'll swarm and suddenly everyone's on their man trying to get the ball back. And those pressing triggers can be quite complicated. But in this case, watching the replay, I identified one pressing trigger, which we're doing. So it's extremely conservative tactics. You have the only pressing trigger I can identify is if the ball is passed backwards from a Japanese player and the receiver of the ball is not facing forward. That's the only time we're pressing, and that happens maybe 4 times in 90 minutes. So yeah, this was an incredibly conservative game plan. So yeah, is that the right thing? I mean, is there wisdom in the results? I mean, we got the 1-0, or is that maybe a bit too conservative?
I mean, that wasn't pressing. That was depressing, if you ask me. But look, I get a lot of people's sentiment with Popper and sort of his conservative style. I've seen a lot of people sort of jump to his defense saying, well, we're undefeated since he's come in as the national team manager. And obviously that is the case. And he's been massive in sort of seeing us through this rough period that we got left with after Graham Arnold. But I personally would like to see something a bit more proactive, especially with this new generation of Socceroos that we're bringing through. We can't have some of our top stars be stuck with this sort of methodical style of, I guess, regaining possession or winning up high. Look, I don't mind pressing triggers at all. Pressing triggers are absolutely vital. You can't just go pressing whenever the hell you want to. You need to have a plan. However, when you do have a pressing trigger, I think in a game where we should have been going for the win, this is something that I think was understated going into this game. A lot of people going into this game said, oh, well, if we can just avoid defeat against Japan, then that would be great for us. No. We needed to win this because regardless of if we drew or lost, we would have to go to Saudi Arabia and make sure that we don't lose by any means. But since we won, all we have to hope is that we don't lose by 5. Regardless of that, we didn't put in much of an effort to actually sort of put pressure on Japan. They didn't look good in possession at all, especially around the back line. They looked very, very poor in possession. So the fact that we weren't really initiating that press enough is very frustrating. And look, even when we did have those pressing triggers where they'd play it to the wide centre-backs and they'd be facing backwards, the moment they play back to the keeper, whoever is at striker for us, be it Borello or Boyle, just sort of steps off again and then we start the whole process again. Like, we're sort of just letting them play it into our midfield, hoping to pinch it there and then counter. And it didn't work the entire game. Thankfully, we got that one chance at the end where, in all fairness, we did quite well to create it. But apart from that, we did absolutely nothing with our press. And I don't think that's sustainable. Absolutely not sustainable. I'm fine with this for now if you're looking to sort of see out results. But post 2026, after the World Cup, we need to be reevaluating what we're going to be doing going forward because a defensive style, or at least as cautious and conservative a defensive style as this, is not sustainable for the types of players that we have coming through in Australian football.
The funniest thing was one of our best chances came from when we screwed up our pressing triggers. Borello's just kind of standing there. And I guess Japan started getting into a rhythm of knowing our pressing triggers and they just passed the ball to them. Unfortunately, not much came of that, but that was incredibly conservative. Let's talk about the actual starting 11 and what we did in possession. Watching it a second time, we had 3 modes of possession. So one was trying to zip our way through their press rather than work through it. We're trying to get a ball to a striker or dribble our way through within 3 passes. So extremely aggressive. So if you do that, your possessions are either resulting in a chance or you're losing the ball within 3 passes. So extremely aggressive. Or we're going the long pass and then probably a recycling possession. We do that for the first time around about 22nd minute, and then we do that towards the back end of the game, probably to conserve energy. It looked like we're only doing that to conserve energy. So we have these extremely we're going to try and get a chance the moment we get a possession. We're not going to build through the press or trying to work through the thirds, which again is, I don't know if conservative is the right word, but it is extremely not backing our technique to be able to handle that level of squeezing. Do you think that's justified with the personnel we have, or do you think maybe you'd like at least a few times to just try and work through the press, work through the thirds?
Look, I'm not really too sure on that, to be honest. I think in terms of the starting lineup, I pretty much had no problems with anything in that defense or midfield. My main concern was the attack. And here's my thing with that attack that we lined up with. Boyle, absolutely no issues there. Needs to be in our starting 11 every single time. Metcalf should never be involved in a national team front line ever again. I don't know what that decision was. I didn't see a single thing that he did there that even came close to justifying his selection in the starting 11, let alone in the starting 11 in the front line. And the most baffling of choices for me is Brandon Borrello. He single-handedly put up one of the worst national team performances I can remember post-2022 World Cup. I don't understand that selection at all. And here's my problem, is that from the way Borrello was playing, it was very clear that Popovic wanted sort of a hold-up play striker that could hold on to it, allow the wingers to sort of get into the game, and then maybe we can counter or attack with numbers or, is really strong with the pressing triggers. Fair enough. I can see why, if he's wanting to sort of go after those pressing triggers early on, why he doesn't want to start Mitch Duke. But if you're looking for someone who's accomplished in being able to hold up the ball in possession, sort of play off of the runners from midfield and off the wings, why are you not starting Adam Taggart? That is my question. And even better is when you're looking to expose a tired Japanese defense, maybe with the pressing triggers, why are you not putting Mohamed Toure in your squad when he is easily probably your best pressing forward, is what I genuinely want to know. Some of his other decisions as well, sort of bringing Daniel Arzani on as late as he did, was really baffling to me. Look, if there was ever a game to play, listen, you've heard me countless times on this podcast, Graham. You know my opinions of Mitch Duke. If there was ever a game where Mitch Duke needed to be in the squad, and let me just point this out now, Mitch Duke shouldn't be nowhere near the Australian national team. I genuinely don't think he's in our top 8 current strikers.
But if there's ever a game where you want someone of Mitch Duke's profile, it is this game. So for the exact reason of that, I don't know why exactly we're starting Brandon Borrello outside of the fact that maybe we wanted to press a bit higher. But we didn't even do that. We just waited for pressing triggers, and they came about not even that often. And every single time they screwed up with their sort of playing out from the back, one pass back to the keeper and we reset into our deep block. So I don't really know what we were going for there with the selection. I think Brandon Borrello was incredibly poor. And
yeah, so I don't want to give too much crap to Borrello because obviously, look, he was put in a crappy situation with sort of how Popovic looked to use him, but you can't be selecting Brandon Borrello in a 2025 national team squad when you're looking at the likes of Iran Kunda, Segicic, Milanovic, Garan Qual, and you're not thinking that those are the kinds of impact players that you need, yet you're looking at the likes of Brandon Borrello to go into our most important qualifying games in 4 years. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, just on the point of the front line, rewatching the game was very, very interesting because I kind of started to get the game plan, and I do think we chose the wrong front line for the game plan. Metcalf, okay, I can see that completely shut down one side of the defense, but our front three won 2 out of 17 aerial duels the entire match. So that's, if you're doing a lot of long passes, a lot of long balls, and that's one of your way to bypass a press, and you're looking to use those long passes to try and spread the Japanese out a bit more so they can work through the thirds, back your technique a bit more, then you need some taller players. Metcalf, Borrello, Boyle are all 178 centimeters or quite short. And secondly, I think only Boyle of those threes is particularly quick. I think the front three which Popovic wanted to start would have been Leckie, Yangi, and Metcalf. Those are, then you've got a quick person in Yangi, a quick person in Leckie, and both of those are winning a lot of aerial duels. And Leckie can do on the right what Metcalf's doing on the left in terms of defense and just making that a bit more solid. So I think he had that in mind maybe when he was first starting that camp. Of course, he couldn't play Yangi because he just did not look like he'd trained all year, according to him. And Leckie, of course, got injured, but we found out that he would have probably been in the Socceroos and probably starting. But yeah, we just had that route to the Japanese half completely shut down because there's just no height or aerial capacity in that front third. And we're doing a lot of long balls to some very short players and losing many, many aerial duels. And then the quick passes on the ground, trying to get to the striker. We don't have anyone quick enough to really take advantage of that. Of course, Felipe was injured. But then all of this makes it a little bit baffling that Motura isn't in this squad because he's 186 centimeters and he's lightning quick. I haven't looked at his pressing game very much. Maybe that's remedial. Maybe, you say it's very, very strong. So that would be encouraging. But he seems like the absolute perfect player to put there. And he's strong enough to hold the ball up as well. That was one of the problems Borello had was if he was nudged or fouled, either the foul wasn't called or he wasn't able to hold the ball up under that sort of pressure. So that kind of does seem a little bit baffling. It also seems a little bit baffling to stick with that game plan when we don't really have the personnel to take those long balls or make those runs in behind. Okay, let's move on to some of the youth football. And one thing which has been absolutely brilliant, and this has happened during James Johnson's tenure, it's not something which we've seen happen since the old Soccer Australia administration. We now have a lot of friendlies and a lot of friendly tournaments organised. Do you think this is going to make a big difference for their development, their understanding of different playing styles, and the ability to get scouted in Europe?
Look, I think it's extremely important having these youth national teams, constantly competing. One of my biggest problems with Australian football, at least at youth level, is that these players are not being able to compete against top youth prospects around the country. And look, even if it's a minuscule thing, having someone like Lionel Messi attending our under-20 games is really sort of, maybe not as telling as I'm implying it is, but it's a nice sort of little thing to sort of look at and say, hey, look, these guys are getting to go over and have really good experiences and, learn while playing against some of the best youth talents in the world. And, maybe this is a reason why we need to bring back stuff like the Y League and stuff like that, because we're seeing such great development with the under-20s winning the Asian Cup for the first time. It could be so much better. And this is without us raising the fact that we have an FFA that largely has not invested enough in youth football. So just imagine what it could be if we had people at the top that, I guess, didn't take it so lightly.
Yeah, so on taking it lightly, one criticism, one drum I keep banging is a selection of youth coaches. So at the moment, all our youth coaches, I think except for Richard Garcia, have never had any experience coaching club football. And usually when you look at our opposition, there's quite a lot of experience either coaching competitive youth football or competitive club football, ideally both. Now, Richard Garcia wasn't particularly successful. He had 2 seasons at Perth Glory, 25% win rate. And occasionally you get like an absolute winner. So under 20s are coached by an absolutely brilliant coach. He's qualified us 3 times out of 4. But you saw the difference when Graham Arnold took over the under 23s. We qualify for the Olympics, but really struggling to the same quality team, even better quality team. We can't even score a goal 4 years later. And I'm sure these are all brilliant people, but we, for whatever reason, we don't trust NPL coaches to take over these teams. We can't afford successful A-League coaches, and we don't have a National Youth League coach where we can take the top coach. What do you think we're doing wrong? What can we do here?
There is way too much favoritism and way too many jobs for mates going around. And if you want a more prime indicator of this, look at the fact that our assistant coaches in the senior national team, one of them is Paul Ocon Sr., and conveniently, Paul Ocon Jr., his son, is getting national team call-ups despite not really being able to start in the second Portuguese division. But that's besides the point. Look, on a broader scale, we need to be more ambitious with the sort of people that we're bringing in. And I've theorized this for a while, but I never really said it on the pod, but I'll say it now. I genuinely think that the reason that we don't bring in people outside of that sort of niche or that little sort of clique that exists within Football Australia, the reason that we don't sort of go outside of that is because I genuinely believe that Football Australia are worried about anyone who is self-respecting and doesn't have bias towards certain players or coaches coming in and telling us that our structure is completely screwed and it needs to be fixed. I don't think that the people at the top want to hold accountability for it. And if they do want to hold accountability for it, they're not doing a very good job, considering the fact that we supposedly had a worldwide search for a new Socceroos coach and turned up with Tony Popovich. And look, it's never been clearer in Australian football that it is a job for the boys mentality. And this is the reason why we'll continue to suffer, because we don't take ourselves seriously. We are way too loyal when it comes to coaches, underperforming. And look how we used to treat Ange Postecoglou when he was in charge of the youth national teams, how he was publicly slandered time after time for underperforming. Yet we have Graham Arnold playing some of the worst football our national team has done in years. And I will say it time and time again, I am so grateful that we got to the round of 16 of the 2022 World Cup. That was a complete fluke. It was luck. We played terribly the entire tournament. We didn't have one good game. The entire tournament, we played absolutely terribly. And we were incredibly lucky to get as far as we did. However, Graham Arnold not only kept his job after that, he had an awful Asian Cup campaign, kept his job, and then single-handedly nearly tanked our World Cup qualifiers with his opening start against the likes of Bahrain and Indonesia. And after that, wasn't even sacked. He had to leave on his own accord, which is absolutely outrageous. There is way too much loyalty. There is way too much favoritism. And if we actually gave a crap about the development of youth football in this country, we would stop with all this, sort of favoritism and sort of looking out for the old NSL boys and, all that kind of stuff. And we would bring in some serious people that have qualifications, that know what they're doing, and actually want to do something to improve football in this country rather than just keep their name in the spotlight and collect a paycheck from the FA.
Now, on the one hand, it's easy to say that, but if I'm being honest, after growing up watching Tony Vidmar, that image of him crying during the Uruguay and then him getting redemption 4 years later, if I can criticize him on this podcast, but if I'm meeting him in person, I'm probably asking his autograph. A lot of these people, Richard Garcia, Tony Vidmar, of course, Graham Arnold, I saw him in the Argentina match. These are probably really hard people to fire. I don't want to be the one that fire them. Like, these people are absolute legends. So how do we get that accountability? We have no media here. We're the media. We're asking for money. We're not being paid for anyone. We get like 100 views, or probably double that. So we get about 200 views per episode. We're the media. Like, how do we get that accountability? That's not an easy thing to solve, right? I'd be awestruck if I was working in FA and I saw Tony Vidmar. I'm not saying, look, that's not good enough, you're fired. Like, how do we change this culture? What do we do?
I completely agree with you in the sense that, these are legends of our game. And look, if I see Graham Arnold walking down the street tomorrow, as much as I criticize him on this podcast, I will fold like a paper towel and, ask for that man's autograph and a selfie. However, you need to be more ruthless, especially when you're looking for people to take those top spots. Absolutely, you can afford to be loyal when you have, stuff like maybe consultancy roles or maybe like international scouts or something. Positions that are sort of important, yes, but they're not those sort of top dog positions where their performance is directly going to have a massive impact on the way that our entire national sort of football setup is going to go. When your head coach of your national team plays a bad style of football and the team performs poorly, that has disastrous implications for the entirety of your national setup. When you have guys like Richard Garcia, and look, I've spoke to Richie, he's a lovely guy, and he's doing fantastic work at Olympic Kingsway as their sporting director. But when you have guys like Richie Garcia, when you have guys like Tony Vidmar, if you have guys like, I don't even know, Graham Arnold, Tony Popovich, Paul Ocon Sr., when you have guys like that, absolutely you want to keep them around because they are legends. They are sort of, the backbone of your country's footballing history. But you can't rely on them solely to be able to carry you through because they've been here before and they've done it before. That's not how it works. You need people that are going to be able to bring in results. And what I think this administration, or at least Football Australia in general, lacks is accountability. They're not able to own up to their mistakes. Every single time that something goes wrong, it's never their fault. It's always the fault of circumstance and this and that. And, someone can perform like it and they'll say, we're grateful for the job they've done, give them a nice pat on the bum and a nice severance check on their way out. But then they'll continue this same old cycle of recycling these, A-League coaches that, maybe tried to go abroad and it didn't work out. And so now they're coaching the national team. I'm honestly just not inspired by it anymore. And look, I understand people saying that, what could be better for an Australian national team than having an Australian coach, someone who, has donned the green and gold and, knows what it means to wear the shirt. But that's fine, yes. But you have the potential damaging implications of that, which is that you do have someone who's there, who's worn the green and gold. And for some reason, well, it's not for some reason, it's a pretty clear reason. When you have someone who's been around the A-League for 10, 15 years, they're going to have their favorites. They're going to have their personal bias, which is how you end up with people like Luke Bratton, Anthony Caceres, Brandon Borello, Mitch Duke, Jason Davidson, all these guys getting call-ups when the likes of Alex Robertson couldn't get a look in, Dennis Genro couldn't get a look in, Max Ballard still hasn't got a look in, Nectarius Triantis, we might lose him to Greece because he couldn't get a look in. How has it come to this stage where we're actually having to sort of point out why Australian coaches aren't the best thing for Australia? We lack accountability, and it is absolutely clear to see. If you ask any Australian football fan that is looking at the way that Popovich and Graham Arnold ran their national team setups, it is clear as day that there is way too much favoritism, and it is going to actively kill our national team structure.
We need to convince the media that bad youth football is as scary as flares, I guess. I don't know how we get that accountability.
Buddy, hell, I mean, the media in Australia around sports is just so incredibly shallow regardless. But in terms of football, it is even worse. Like, you could see a side playing absolutely brilliant football. Maybe they get a draw against a really good team, and they'll say we're crap because we're not winning. But then we'll go play a really team, win 1-0 while playing absolute dog football, and then they'll say that Tony Popovich is the best thing since sliced bread.
Yeah, well, let's on that note, let's go through the youth results. So we have Brad Maloney in charge of the under-16s. Only one match is televised, but we beat Vietnam 2-1, Saudi Arabia 2-1. Can't comment on those games, but I did watch all his unsuccessful qualifying for the under-17s, not just this tournament, and I also saw the flogging that we received at the hands of China. And to be honest, if I was going to describe his style, it's a little bit like a mullet, the hairstyle of mullet, party at the back, business at the front. You're getting all the razzle-dazzle is happening in your own half, so that he's playing at the back, keeping the ball on the deck, using technical football to gain their territory. And then when you get into their territory, every single ball into the box is aerial. So getting all the risks of possession football with none of the benefits. You don't get to control that final third penetration. So to be honest, I don't think he's up to it. Sure, he's a great guy. He could be talented. If he coaches club football, maybe he learns, maybe he gets up to it. And next, Trevor Morgan. We don't get to watch the match, but there's just nothing negative you can say. 3 out of 4. But then, even then, I'd say the selection process, he doesn't have a club football background, so he's coming from within the FA. He's not a ex-Socceroo, so presumably he's getting there by talent. And in the end, he's really showing his worth. Then under 18, Richard Garcia, we drew 0-0 with Argentina. We lost 3-0 against France. We lost 3-2 against USA. I haven't made up my mind yet. There's one more game against Uruguay. I see enough positives that I'm certainly interested in him. But again, his only background is at Perth Glory. You can tell me whether that was good background or not. On paper, it looks pretty negative.
But he's been doing really good work at Kingsway. Richie's a guy that clearly knows football. He's been taking on a sporting directory role in one of the biggest NPL clubs in Australia, at least one of the best performing NPL clubs in Australia. So he clearly has a knack for it. But yeah, he's someone I would like to see stick around with the youth national team setup personally.
I didn't feel negative about the performances, forget the results. I thought there wasn't any obvious flaws. Now, these are of course friendlies. You don't know how someone is at the mental prep of the game until they're in a tournament. And the mental prep, I think, is Tony Vidmar's biggest issue, because we see with his brother, Aurelio Vidmar, he was also good at the book smarts, but he had the textbook knowledge of the game. But when it came to tournaments, he was very remedial, and it took him a few years at club football before he started to really manage that. And we saw Tony Vidmar, we won 2-0 against South Korea, drew the other game 0-0, and you also saw him in a tournament in the Middle East. He's very, very good when there's no pressure on, but I've never seen a more screwed up preparation to a tournament than I saw in that Eliroos campaign. He's, of course, vilifying Irankunda in the media, which means even if that's the right decision to not leave him in, it means that all the talk within the camp and outside the camp is going to be on Irakunda's non-selection, and he's just not handling that. He's not handling, and we just looked gun shy when we're playing. We just looked missing fairly easy opportunities, which we weren't missing in friendlies. It just looked like my read, and it's hard to tell this from a distance, but my read is he hasn't had that club experience and that knowledge outside of textbook knowledge to really do the mental prep of the game, the man management, and all those things you can't learn in the textbook. I'm not sure. Have you seen, you can give your own comments on these people. You spoke quite positive about Richard Garcia. That's good news. Of course, there's no criticism on Trevor Morgan. Hope he stays. But then there's Brad Maloney and Tony Vidmar as the other two.
One of my biggest criticisms, I'd say, with Australian football coaching in general, and this goes to all levels, this goes to community, this goes to NPL, professional, national team, youth setup, whatever. One of my biggest problems with modern Australian coaches, and obviously there are a few exceptions, and you'll notice who those few exceptions are because they're the very few that are actually able to make it out of Australia and into Europe. But there is a serious problem that we have when it comes to developing coaches that are able to provide success at both ends of the pitches. Now, we have countless coaches that are able to set up solid defensive structure, are able to sort of set up that whole idea of playing out from the back and possession football, great. But it's, as you said with Maloney, there seems to be no sort of structure. And that goes down to every single level of youth team that we have, apart from the under-20s, which is even more credit to Trevor Morgan. He is an absolutely phenomenal coach. He's done absolutely brilliantly with this group that he's had. But when you look at, how the under-23s are as poor as they are in the final third, despite the talent they have, it's clearly not a matter of the players. It's down to the coaching. There is no structure at any of these levels. And it's so clear to see that when you have players that are able to sort of provide this fantastic technical level of football, as soon as they get into the final third, we're relying purely on the individual brilliance of these players because they're not coached properly. There's no situational awareness. We're so focused on teams playing it out from the back and building it up in that possession style of football that we're not allowing these players to actually experiment with freedom. We're not allowing them to sort of work the ball around in the final third, find opportunities, find the space, take the risks. There's none of it. We're just getting the ball out wide, as you said, and just whipping it in for crosses. And if not, we're playing the ball backwards and looking to restart. There is absolutely no urgency at any level. I don't know if it's down to the coaching. I don't know if it's down to sort of instructions from above as to how we want our national teams to play, but it needs to be reviewed because it's seriously affecting the performances of our youth teams. And look, if our youth teams don't do well, our senior teams are probably not going to do well. So if the under-20s are doing fantastic and playing beautiful football, and then you look at the under-23s and they're playing absolute dross, I think it's a pretty clear indication as to whether or not it's down to the talent or the coaching. In my opinion, it's purely down to the coaching.
And especially supporting that point, we see pretty big variation in the results that different coaches at youth level get, and also pretty big variation in the performance which they achieve as well, which seems to suggest that the coach makes a huge difference. Okay, we've had some discussion about some of the negatives of our coach selection in Australia. Let's talk about one of the brighter stories, or bright until recently, and probably bright in the future. Ange sacked this week. That was a bit of a gut punch for a lot of fans. Obviously, he won a Europa trophy, but in the end, I guess the league position cost him. It looks like the fan base is divided. Yeah, what are your thoughts? How do you process that?
In my opinion, this is probably the biggest telling of how sort of, I guess, just dysfunctional the entirety of Tottenham Hotspur's board structure is from top to bottom. Now, looking at Daniel Levy and sort of how he's treated coaches in the past, he's had several successful coaches. You look at the likes of Mourinho, you look at the likes of Conte, you look at the likes of Pochettino, and a lot of these guys, performed fairly well, got top four, did very well, but also look at the way that a lot of them went out of their jobs. Mourinho getting Spurs to a cup final against City and then getting sacked. You have Conte going out on poor terms. Pochettino went out, incredibly successful Spurs manager. I'd probably say one of the most successful Spurs managers of the modern era, if not the most successful in terms of what he was able to achieve with that team. But then you look at it and say, well, okay, he did all this. He got us to a Champions League final. He got us, top four in the Prem. He never won us a trophy. You look at Ange and all the problems he's had, this depleted Spurs squad that he had last season, losing Harry Kane and having to replace him with Dominic Solanke. And then you look at the fact that he lost, several other players as well. His midfield was depleted. His backline was depleted. All the injuries he had this year. There came a stage where for 11 games straight, he was playing a teenage Archie Gray, who's a natural centre midfielder at centre back. And yes, he had a very poor league finish and very poor league form. But out of all of this, he managed to win Spurs their first European trophy since 1984 and their first trophy in 17 years by winning the Europa League and beating out Manchester United in the final to do it. That was an incredible achievement. And I don't care if people say that they had an easy run to the final or this or that. Spurs had an incredibly rough run this year. And any team that has those sort of really bad runs with injuries will be able to look at you and say, okay, well, look, it wasn't a great season. We didn't have any success. But, the big reason is we had all these injuries. We had all these changes to the squad. The fact that Spurs came out of that with a European trophy and still felt the need to change up their management was absolutely wild. And you look at what Ange meant to some of those Spurs players, just what you hear from guys like Heung-min Son, guys like James Maddison, guys like Pedro Porro, and how they speak so highly of Ange and what he means to the team and how they couldn't have done anything without him and how they inspired him, how he inspired them to be able to drive on to this sort of success. It just baffles me how you can then make that call to sack him. And even more so when you look at, the fact that they're planning to bring in Thomas Frank, who, yes, is doing well with Brentford, but is this really the guy that you want to be bringing in after sacking Ange Postecoglou, who is a serial winner? He's won on the international stage, he's won in Australia, he's won in Japan, he's won in Scotland, he's now won in Europe, and you're looking to replace him with Thomas Frank, who, don't get me wrong, I am a fan of Thomas Frank, and I think he's very pragmatic, which is sort of good for a modern footballing coach, and he's very dynamic as well with his sort of free-flowing style with his Bournemouth side. But if you're not going to be able to give Thomas Frank the right tools, I don't know if this is going to turn out any better than Ange did. And I especially do not expect Tottenham to be winning any silverware under Thomas Frank. I didn't expect it under Ange, to be fair, because Tottenham for me is just that sort of bozo club that is just destined to never achieve anything. But Ange got them something. And you know what? I think Ange was incredibly hard done by the club. He deserved a lot better than what he got. And I know a lot of Spurs fans gave him a lot of crap and eventually did sort of come around to him towards the end, which is ironic considering that it sort of took him winning a European trophy for them to come around to him. But I think if you go on social media and look at the reactions of a lot of Spurs fans and Spurs fans' accounts, it's very clear that majority of the fan base do not like this decision. And absolutely fair enough. You have a guy that you only gave 2 years to rebuild and revamp a very young squad filled with youthful signings that are either coming from the Championship or, in Bergvall's case, coming from Sweden. And you're asking him to do what exactly? He's won you a European title. He did okay in the Cups. What more are you asking him for? I mean, look, Daniel Levy said the league performances were the basis for it. Okay, sure, fine. But why do you care so much when you have a depleted squad for the entire season? Your investment into the squad has been incredibly poor. He's got you Champions League football and he's got you a European title. So what is the problem here? What exactly is the problem here? He's a coach that the fans clearly love. The players clearly adore him. And he has that sort of pull that you need for a big manager. We even look back to the most recent transfer window and the fact that Matthias Tell rejected Tottenham and was going to leave elsewhere and then got a phone call from Ange. In the space of an hour, Ange changed the mind of one of the world's most promising young forwards who was dead set against joining Spurs. In an hour, Ange convinced him. That is the kind of pull that you need from a big manager. And that's the kind of pull that you're losing when you get rid of someone like Ange with his sort of style of attacking football and his pedigree and background that he has as a successful coach by replacing him with Thomas Frank. And I don't understand it at all. And look, I know that there's going to be people in the comments section or, people in the forums saying, oh, well, you can't have Tottenham finish in 17th and not expect them to be sacked, even if they do win, yada, yada. Clubs have bad seasons, all right? And the Premier League nowadays is more tight than it has ever been. It is more high quality than it has ever been. And I understand 17th is an awful position for a supposed Big Six club. But this is a Big Six club that is also going to be in the Champions League next season on the back of winning a European trophy for the first time in over 4 decades. And your decision is to then sack the manager. It's absolutely disgusting. I think Daniel Levy's an absolute idiot. I think Tottenham will have no success next season or for the seasons coming forward. And I pray for nothing but the downfall of Daniel Levy and Tottenham Hotspur Football Club.
So you mentioned the injury and the injury crisis Ange faced. Do you think that could be partly his fault? Because Bielsa is also a very similar style coach to Ange. Super coach, has a bit of a very ideological, very strong philosophy, wants all impact, all action. A lot of people are warning that this is harder to do in the Premier League. You have more intensity, which is permitted by the more permissive refereeing. It's almost as bad as Scotland, where you almost have to get a handgun out and shoot someone before it's a foul. Very permissive refereeing, longer season than most leagues in the continent. And same thing happened with Bielsa. He gets Leeds promoted. The second season has very poor results because he has this massive injury crisis. And it seemed, at least from some of the murmurings around the club, that they did actually blame Ange for the injury crisis.
You can say that. I understand why people would say that, but I also have to say that it is purely down to luck. You look at the style that Arsenal have played in recent years. They've played the exact same way under Arteta pretty much for the past 5 years. In each of the last 5 years, apart from this one, they've been relatively fortunate with not having any serious injuries. But this year, Gabriel, Saliba, Ben White, Bukayo Saka, so many players, key players out with long-term injuries. That's not down to style of football. Sometimes it just happens. And it is really unfortunate. But I think people need to remember that in football, happens, man. And, for lack of a better term, it is just the case. It happens. And you look at the way Pep Guardiola's Man City played when he first came into City. You think back to that Centurion season, you think back to when they were the Formidables, won every single English domestic trophy. and kept a relatively clean injury record. But then you have those seasons where they really dropped off compared to Liverpool, playing a more sort of slow, methodical style of football and had way more injuries. Look at this season, all the injury problems Man City had. Edison out. They had Haaland out. De Bruyne out long term. They had Bernardo Silva out. Ruben Diaz out. Ake, Akanji, Stones. So many players out long term. Rodri with an ACL injury. Sometimes stuff just happens, man. And that is purely what it is. When players are going from that consistent workload of, maybe doing heaps to not doing heaps, you look at Spurs, one thing I would say to Ange is that he definitely had his favourites with his squad and only really rotated when there was sort of injuries and stuff like that. But as a director of football or as an owner, you need to be able to back him up with quality depth so that he is able to rotate. The fact that Ange is looking at the possibility of, let's be honest here, Jed Spence had one of the best renaissances out of any footballer in world football this season. But if you said to me at the start of the season that Tottenham's backup right back, if they lost Pedro Porro, would have been Jed Spence, I think any Tottenham fan or any self-respecting Tottenham fan would have rather stepped in front of an oncoming train than had to have witnessed that. And that goes for a lot of their midfield as well. Like, come on, you're telling me the backup to James Maddison is Lucas Bergvall? There was no quality depth in that squad. The squad was too young. There were a lot of players that were relatively injury prone, a lot of players that needed to be replaced, a lot of key players that went out due to injuries. And obviously, when you play a high octane, high intensity style of football, there are going to be more injuries than normal, but you do need to be able to back that up with more depth signings, with, maybe giving him some good people that when he is having those players that are getting tired or need a rest, he's able to bring in a quality player to replace them that is not going to detrimentally lower the quality of the squad, which unfortunately they didn't give him. If you want to make the argument that Ange is the direct cause of the injuries, it's a stupid argument because in football, stuff happens. People can go seasons without injury. People can go whole careers without injury. People can have no injury for 5 years and then all of a sudden in the space of 3 years have 3 terrible injuries. It happens. It's unfortunate. But if you're any self-respecting club, you need to be able to have the sort of decency and I guess the sort of foresight to be able to say, if we do have a coach that's going to play a high intensity style of football, maybe we do need to get a deeper squad so that he is able to rotate when needed.
So on the league position versus trophy, we had a very similar situation here in Australia where Ufuk Talay on the verge of getting an ACL2 trophy, but had a very disappointing league season. In his case, we weren't given that dilemma because he ended up losing both. But if, say, Sydney FC, suppose they win the ACL2 trophy and then he has a similar disappointing season in the A-League, would you sympathise with people who say, no, a trophy in the continent is not as important as a good league season? Or would you say, no, the continental trophy, that would absolutely make it insane to sack them, we should keep them?
The continental trophy is, look, I'm one of the people that is in the boat that Ufuk Talay shouldn't have been kept on. However, if he did win the ACL2, you can't make the argument that he should go. You really can't. And the reason for that is you look at the back line that he's had to deal with, Zach de Jesus having to fill in at centre back at times, even sort of the losses that he's had in midfield, the likes of Leo Sainer, Douglas Costa going out to injury as well. There's been several cases this season where you do look at it and say, well, look, you do have a good quality front line, but you can't really do anything without a high quality defense. The amount of academy players that they've had to bring through, the likes of Aaron Gerd, he's not really that fantastic, but he had an extended run with the first team. But even the ones that they do bring through, like Gerd and Shaw coming into the team doing well and then getting injured again, you can look at it and say, okay, that's unfortunate. I do think that success is a big indicator as to, how good of a coach you are. If you have a depleted squad and you're still able to, churn out trophies, I think that's absolutely fantastic. In Ufuk Talay's case, he should have been able to get that win in the Asian Cup. I still think his squad was high quality enough to be able to win the ACL2. He didn't. They should have been good enough to get finals. He didn't. And I think that's down to his coaching performances. I think a lot of Sydney fans will be sort of with me on that argument. But I think it's completely different to Ange's case because, look, with Talay, he still had the best attack in the league and the best midfield in the league. His defense was terrible. Don't get me wrong. He had one of the worst goalkeepers in the league and an awful back line. So if there's one thing that I can say is that maybe you can't expect consistency from your squad. But for the sake of not expecting consistency, you have to at least be able to expect a good style of football that makes the most of what you have. Ange made the most of what he had. and that's what I can give him credit for. He made the most of what he had and he churned out a European trophy. Talay didn't make the most of what he had. He played Joe Lolly at left wing back in a crucial game in their season. I don't know how that's, or if that's forgivable. I personally don't think it is. I think it's sacrilegious. But Talay's made a number of poor decisions. You have Segicic, who he just refused to rely on at all, despite being the tied golden boot for the A-League. I think that's just one of the many, many reasons why I think Talay's had a really poor season and why I think Ange's sacking was not justified, but Talay's sacking maybe would have been.
Yes, as you say, in the end, Talay doesn't have the trophy to go with it. So speaking of Ufak Talay, let's move on to the A-League season that was. It's a bit unfortunate this pod is hosted by a Brisbane Roar fan and a Perth Glory fan because I don't know if we'll have too much positive to say, right?
This is the one part of the podcast that I was regretting doing. So I think you and I would both like to wrap this up as quickly as possible, but we promise to stay impartial and give some actual good takes rather than just trauma dumping on our audience.
Well, let's talk about the good stuff, which is to do with almost every club but ours. Although one thing includes ours. Let's talk about this year. We saw youth absolutely everywhere. And I think I did see a drop in quality the first 10 matches, but then if you compare the last 15 matches this year to last year, I thought it was pretty similar. And we all of a sudden have too many prospects to keep track of. We don't have one wonder kid. We have who's barely getting game time or whatever. We now have the top 4 on the Golden Boot race were all under 23 Aussies. My side had Harrington, which I think is absolute standout at the under-18 tournament I just saw. We also had Klein, which, certainly seems a prospect, born 2004, so getting on a bit. And of course, Brizete, who's showing a bit of promise. Perth Glory, you can talk about your side.
I just want to mention quickly Brizete from you guys as well. He is one of the most underrated, but also probably one of my favorite young Australian players in the A-League at the moment. Yeah, in terms of the Glory, look, some of the really nice players we've seen coming through this year. Zach Lizalaiski early on in the season was fantastic. Adriano Labib looked phenomenal. And obviously, you can't go past the Prince of Perth himself, Jalen Pearman. Oh my God. What more can I say about Jalen Pearman? Well, he's getting his move to QPR, which is really nice. He's going to be linking up with Daniel Benny there. And possibly Keely Adamson, if all rumours are true regarding Keely Adamson's future. But look, like you said, this has been a phenomenal year for pretty much the entirety of the A-League in terms of just production of youth players and just, promising youth talents. You can probably just go through every team in the league and be able to list off incredible youngsters. In fact, the only team in the league where I'd say they don't really have, sort of out of this world youngsters would probably be Auckland, which is ironic considering that they were probably one of the best teams in the league they were consistently the best team in the league this year. But you look at the likes of Melbourne City, having guys like Mehmeti, having guys like Lapane, Truan, Lawrence Wong. You look at Western United having Grimaldi and Botic and Dylan Leonard and Sharmoon, Kane Vidmar. You look at Western Sydney Wanderers having, Milanovic, Sapsford, Victory, having the likes of Teague, Casey Boss, Adelaide United. They've always got quality youngsters, but Goodwin having a phenomenal season, joint top scorer in the A-League. Sydney, obviously, Segicic, joint top scorer as well. MacArthur, maybe a bit of a slower year for them. A slower year for MacArthur, I'd say, in terms of bringing through promising youth prospects. But Keely Adamson, probably the standout right back in the league for me this year. He was absolutely incredible. You got the Jets, once again, maybe a slow year for them, but Clayton Taylor and Eli Adams, they were absolutely firing on all cylinders. Central Coast, I'd say surprisingly also a slow year for them, but even so, still bringing through the likes of DeLima. Hayne Eames looks like he's going to be a phenomenal player. And look, even the likes of our own Brisbane Roar and Perth Glory, like you mentioned, Brizete, Klein, Harrington on your guys' end. And on our end, Labib, Pim, and Lizalaiski. Even the Phoenix, bringing through guys like Sloan Rodriguez, Corbin Piper. Like, there's some incredible talents coming through the A-League right now. And it's a very, very exciting time. I also think it's directly correlating with the fact that with the rise of global scouting networks, there's a lot of clubs that are sort of starting to respect our league more when it comes to transfer valuations and lengths of contracts offered to Australian players. It's really good to see. And overall, this is what's best for the growth of Australian football. We need to accept that the A-League for a long, long time, if not for the rest of time, is going to be a development league for these big European leagues. But that's not something to be ashamed of. The fact that we're able to develop these high-quality youngsters and then send them out for these really promising spells in Europe, that will overall benefit not only the survival of the A-League and the benefit of our clubs financially, but also the development of our national team and our national youth teams. That's something to be incredibly proud of. You look at our national teams now and look at how many of those players came through the ranks of A-League clubs. That is incredible. It's definitely something to be proud of for a country like us in terms of our national team structure and how we're pushing players through once they reach the senior level. It's just, I think our biggest struggle is helping them reach the senior level. Once we get those players to the senior level, lots of them kick on really quickly. And I think that a lot of the clubs are doing a great service to their young players with how they're being treated once they do get to that level. But I would like to see more players getting to that level on a wider scale.
So it feels like this year has marked a complete ideological shift. The ideological winds are completely changing. When the A-League started, I guess you're quite young when that happened, this was a destination league. This is not a development league. This is a destination league. And there's almost no youth for many, many years. Now we're a development league and we're proud of it. When we started, there was this idea of we want families as the main target audience to get mainstream Australia in. And then that, of course, culminated in this war on active support, which happened under the Gallup era. Now you see Melbourne Victory's CEO going into bat for Melbourne Victory's active support. It's not a complete change. We don't have every single club and the APL going to bat for active support, but that seems to be another change. When the A-League started, you had this belief that ethnicity and ethnic clubs you cannot even have a single ethnic club, no matter how successful they are individually, on the national stage, because to quote Lou Sticker, his infamous quote, it's like mixing dirty water with clean water. You won't get anyone, even if a broad-based club like Perth Glory is successful off the pitch, you won't get anyone else coming. Now there's firstly of traditional migrant communities being welcomed back in the second tier, and even some of those being invited possibly to the A-League. There's been some whispers about that. We started as a salary cap league. We're going to be similar to NRL. We're going to be similar to AFL. Now there's talk of going to a fair play system like they have in England. Is it still the A-League now? I mean, I'm happy with the vast majority of these changes. I would prefer a luxury tax to a fair play system, personally. But in any case, I'm very, very happy with most of these changes. It's still going to be called the A-League, but it's completely ideologically shifted in a very short amount of time.
I completely agree, but I also agree on the fact that it is for the better. Look, while we love our classic A-League and all of its quirks and all of its funny little moments, we do have to accept that it is a largely imperfect league and it does need to be fixed. You have clubs that are consistently, our biggest clubs losing, nearly tens of millions of dollars every single year just to be run. It's not sustainable. And I do like some of the sort of changes that we are going for to help generate revenue for these clubs, to be able to sort of set up the long-term sustainability of our professional football pyramid. And look, one of these big things for me is going to be an improved domestic transfer system. I do think a luxury tax needs to be brought in at some point. I've already suggested that there needs to be a reward for clubs that are able to raise transfer revenue through the sales of players. That needs to be rewarded instead of just shunned and pushed aside. But look, there's a lot of good moves being made by the APL, I will say. Not everything is perfect. I think we can all agree. Nothing is pretty much ever perfect with Australian football. But I can see that they're clearly doing their best. And that's all that matters to me, is that we have people at the top who clearly care about the game and the development of the game and are here to sort of see it through and do what's best for its progression.
So is there any player this year that you'd say, gee, I wish I'd see that person in a Socceroos jersey? Obviously, setting aside the fact that we have a coach with their particular ideology and how they go about their Socceroos selection, if you could choose a Socceroos team tomorrow, is there anyone which you like just really, really stood out to you? You can list 10, you can list 1, whatever.
So any Australian player.
Mm-hmm. In the A-League.
Alex Robertson, without a doubt. But if you're going in the A-League, obviously you can say the easy ones like Milanovic, Segacic. You know what? I'm going to go outside the box here. I'm going to say out of everyone in the A-League that I would have liked to have seen get a national team call-up, I would have liked to have seen both Panakikianis and Keely Adamson. I think both could have been great additions to the national team, especially in those games against Indonesia and China, where we were sort of looking to have more possession of the ball and maybe attack a bit more. I think Keely Adamson could have been a great addition. And look, I completely think that these two players are going to be massive additions for our national team sides going forward, but I would have liked to have seen their inclusion at some point. Look, obviously you still have the likes of Segicic, you have the likes of Milanovic, Botic, Archie Goodwin. Hopefully they get a run in with the national team soon. There's plenty of good young players that are going to come through and they're going to get their time in the sunshine. Jalen Pearman, another one that I think is not too far away from getting a national team call-up if he keeps performing in the way he does. It's an exciting time. It's a very, very exciting time for A-League fans. It's a very, very exciting time for Australian football fans when you look at the young players coming through and the success that we're having with groups like the under-20s under Trevor Morgan. Hopefully the FA and the APL can do the right things and pretty much secure the long-term progression of football in this country overall.
You stole my one. I was going to go for Addison myself. No disrespect to Miller. I think he's the best right back we've had since Luke Wiltshire for the national team. And you could also say that, maybe we should have produced better right backs. Fair enough. But he's doing his best job there. And obviously criticize him on the show. Met him in person. I'd take his autograph if he'd give it to me after my criticism. But Addison is the first right back prospect in the entire history of the A-League I can remember. And he's a standout every time I watch him play. He's a standout when he played for the ACN All-Stars against Manchester United. Obviously, that's a fairly strange match. He's a standout when I see him for the under-23s. I really hope he hits a ground running in England. So finally, the grand final. Did you manage to catch it? Derby grand final, which is just a gift to organisers. I think we got a rugby league referee that match. There's a lot was being ignored. But did you watch it? What were your thoughts?
My thoughts were, in terms of a final, it really wasn't that good of a game. But I have mentioned this on my YouTube channel before because I did a sort of brief recap of the game. In terms of a football game, it wasn't great, but it had that grand final feel, which is something that I feel is missing a lot of times with Australian football in terms of A-League grand finals. You look at the Mariners' victory, stuff like that, not really a great final, but I think that the Melbourne Derby was fantastic. I think that we had a really good sort of turnout and attendance. And look, obviously you can sort of shame Melbourne City and say that, look, why do your fans only turn up for the finals? They should be turning up for the entire season. And that's true. That's absolutely true. However, it's nice to see a good turnout for the final. Biggest turnout in Amy Park in their history. Look, the Melbourne Derby, it's everything you wanted. It was loud. It was heated. It was aggressive. It was fiery. There was about 4 different fight started in the space of 20 minutes in one period. You had Matthew Leckie getting his face kicked in by Zinedine Machach and having to wear a headband around his nose for the entirety of the game, pretty much. It was fun. It was a spectacle, I'll say that much.
Alrighty, so one last question before we go. Let's fast forward to 10 years from now. Suppose the national second tiers, home and away. Suppose the A-League's expanded. We got a full connected pyramid. Crowds are up. Everything's pumping. We finally managed to convince the media that football fans aren't scary. With all that, we get everything we want. Are you still keeping the Star Wars ground? Are you still keeping Unite round? Are you still keeping the grand final? All the weird parts of our A-League. And the sauce bottles at Central Coast.
You know what? Out of all the things you mentioned, somehow the least likely thing is the media not thinking that A-League fans are the epitome of the devil. But I think the most important thing with the A-League is to not lose its identity and lose its sense of self. This is, for lack of a better terms, one of the most insane professional football leagues on earth. You have football that people believe is incredibly low quality, yet it seems like every week where you have a 9-goal thriller to sit back and watch. You have stadiums with massive sauce bottles that are nearly as big as some of the stands. You have Darth Vader bringing out the ball. You have a mini Isuzu Ute driving out the ball to the grand final. Like, it is such a funny league and it's so enjoyable. I love that this is my local league that I'm able to just follow and just enjoy all the little things, the good and the bad, the beautiful and the ugly. And that's important to me. That's important that the A-League doesn't lose its sense of self. Look, you can make all the changes you want. You can make it a 16-team A-League with a 16-team second division and all this stuff. But I think the one thing that you can never bring away from the A-League, no matter how hard you try, is its sense of spirit. And what makes the A-League is the fact that I truly believe any self-respecting A-League fan is happy to sit back, watch their team through thick and thin, whether they're or great, and they're able to accept the fact that we love this league and we want to see it get better, but we're also able to accept the fact that this league is imperfect and it is flawed, and sometimes it is just the dumbest thing you've ever seen. It's also the craziest thing you've ever seen. It's also the funniest thing you've ever seen. And that's why I think it's so close to our hearts as Australian football fans, is because I think while we can watch European football, you can watch the Prem, you can watch Serie A, you can watch the Bundesliga, you can watch Ligue 1, you can watch La Liga, you can watch all of this and you can get much, much better quality football, but you can't get you can't get that close to home feeling. You can't get that sort of heart and soul that you get with the Australian A-League.
Oh, that's a beautiful speech. I wholeheartedly agree. I hope that for all the other changes I'd like to see in Australia, I hope that we stay true to ourselves. In fact, the whole history of Australian football has been, in one way or another, not accepting who we are. And that's so many of our problems have stemmed from that. So in light of that, if we get everything we want, please keep Darth Vader, please keep giant sauce bottles, please keep all the craziness of our league.
Keep Unite Round, please.
Yes, keep Unite Round.
Just
It's
move to a new
absolutely
city every year, I promise.
Hopefully in Cairns. That would be brilliant.
If you want to, I don't know if I've said this on the pod before. If you want to revive Unite Round Gold Coast as the soft launch for the Gold Coast United return to the A-League.
Do it during Schoolies Week. It'd be brilliant. So, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for joining us, Alex, and thanks for those listening to us. That's all we have time for today on this episode of Green and Gold FC. Please join us on the forum, greenandgoldfc.com. Please hit that button, like and subscribe, whether you get us on YouTube, Spotify, or on Apple Podcasts. It really does help us. And don't forget our Patreon. It will keep this show on the road. Thank you so much for joining us. But until next time, it's bye for now.